Hello everybody, welcome back to another timeline series. Today we're doing the Supreme Court Decision Timeline, Episode 1. So what is the Supreme Court Decision Timeline? Well, in this timeline, the Supreme Court chooses the President, and there are some added rules to the Constitution in this timeline. The first one is that the Supreme Court chooses the President, that we've already established that. The second rule, the House of Representatives will choose Associate Justices, while the Senate will choose the Chief Justice. There are 9 total justices. It would be declared unconstitutional to increase or decrease the number of justices within the Supreme Court. The Constitutional Congress first chooses the first president, then the president will choose the first set of justices. The president will serve a life term, only leaving office via impeachment, removal, resigning, or death. The role of the vice president will be elected every 4 years. The vice president would serve as acting president until a new president is named. And all 9 members of the Supreme Court are needed to name a new president. If the president were to die around the same before an associate justice could be named, we couldn't have another president, just an acting president until a new associate justice is named. And so here's the initial Supreme Court after the first president. Of course, we have Chief Justice John Jay, Associate Justice John Rutledge, Associate Justice William Cushing, Associate Justice James Wilson, Associate Justice John Blair, Associate Justice James Iredell, Associate Justice Thomas Johnson, Associate Justice William Patterson, and Associate Justice Samuel Chase. A 9-0 conservative court. In 1788, George Washington is made President George I by the Continental Congress, so he is known not as President Washington, but President George I. That is just me. I just wanted to do that. The U.S. Constitution is ratified along with the Bill of Rights in 1788. 1789, Thanksgiving is made a national holiday, as well as the 1789 vice presidential election, where Federalist Minister John Adams defeats Democratic Republican George Clinton 57-12 to become the first vice president. 1790, the U.S. Census would be authorized, as well as establishing the U.S. patent system. There would also be the Compromise of 1790. Also, Vice President John Adams would submit the Alien and Sedition Acts to George I, and he would veto it, the first act of a presidential veto. 1791, Associate Justice John Rutledge would resign from office, and Congress would appoint Oliver Ellsworth to the Supreme Court. Washington, D.C. would also be established during this year. 1792, the Postal Service Act would be passed, as well as the passage of the Coinage Act. And we have the 1792 vice presidential election, where Democratic-Republican Governor George Clinton would defeat Federalist Vice President 87-55. Sorry about that. George Clinton would win just because the thought of the First Amendment being restricted by Vice President Adams was very unpopular amongst a lot of people. In 1793, Associate Justice Thomas Johnson would resign. And so, 2, 3, maybe 4 months later, Congress would appoint William Johnson to the Supreme Court, and a Johnson replaced with a Johnson. Johnson and Johnsons. The Fugitive Slave Act would be passed by President George I, as he would also sign the Neutrality Proclamation.
Where are you at? I can't see you. Look. Yeah, he's making a
Sorry about that. There would also be the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. In 1794, there would be the Whiskey Rebellion. If you don't know what the Whiskey Rebellion is, the Whiskey Rebellion is a rebellion of multiple Revolutionary Army veterans who were pissed off because their whiskey is now being taxed. President George I would send in a militia after he would ask them, or beg, I've heard 2 different stories, ask them to quell it, and they did. 1795, Chief Justice John Jay would resign, as well as Associate Justice John Blair. The Senate would appoint Bushrod Washington to the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice, while the House would appoint Henry Livingston to the Supreme Court. The Naturalization Act of 1795 would replace and repeal the Naturalization Act of 1790. George I would also pass the 11th Amendment, which is lawsuit restrictions against the federal government. And U.S. and Spain would sign the Treaty of Madrid. 1796, the U.S. and Tripoli would sign the Treaty of Tripoli. Yes. And of course, we have the 1796 vice presidential election, where Democratic-Republican Vice President George Clinton would defeat Federalist Governor Thomas Pinckney 85-54 to win re-election. George Clinton is proven to be a very popular vice president. In 1797, the President George I would realize, okay, hold up, we can't have the Vice President serving more than 8 years. And he would sign the 12th Amendment, which is term limits for the Vice President and Vice Presidential succession. So here is what the Vice Presidential succession line would look like today, on your right. And if you're not asking, the cabinet is chosen by the President, not the Vice President, just to let you know. In 1798, Associate Justice James Wilson resigns from the Supreme Court, in which the House would appoint Alfred Moore to replace him. President George I would deal with the XYZ affair, and the U.S. Marine Corps would be established, and the U.S. and Cherokee Nation would sign the Treaty of Tellico. Associate Justice James Iredell would pass away, but also, not long after, President George I would die. As, of course, this would be the first instance, which people were hoping this wasn't the first instance, of just being the first time a president dies, being so soon after an Associate Justice dies and before he gets replaced. The House would appoint John Marshall to the Supreme Court. And this would, of course, and then the Supreme Court would then name former Vice President John Adams was the top choice for Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson was the top choice from the Democratic-Republican side. And of course, seeing it as a 7-2 conservative court, they would appoint John Adams. President John I would pass the Logan Act, which would begin the Quasi-War. Associate Justice Oliver Ellsworth would resign in early 1800, in which the House would appoint John Chew Thomas to the Supreme Court. This is a first irregularity. The first change in this timeline, where John Chew Thomas was not in the Supreme Court originally, he was a congressman from Delaware, I think. Of course, we also have the 1800 election where Democratic-Republican Secretary Thomas Jefferson would defeat Federalist Minister Charles Pinckney, 81-57, to become the third vice president. 1801, the first Barbary Wars begin, and President John I would sign the Alien and Sedition Acts, which makes him a very, very unpopular president. And Congress would seek to impeach President John I for the Alien Sedition Acts. They begin now. And President John I would also sign the Judiciary Act of 1802. He's not really bothered by the impeachment effects, but Democratic Republicans don't have enough votes in the Senate, so they hope to push us out as far as they can. So, during the lame duck session, a vote is finally come upon. This will be known as the longest... Mom, she's up there. As the longest impeachment trial ever, lasting almost an entire year. The House would impeach President John I 67-38 for abuse of power and obstruction of the Constitution. And President John I passed the Enabling Act of 1802. As a Christmas surprise, kind of, the Supreme Court would rule that it is unconstitutional for cases to be carried over from one Congress to the next. So the Supreme Court forces the current Congress to vote on John Adams' removal from office before the next Congress begins. And during the lame duck session near the end, President John I is acquitted 17-14 votes from the charges by 3 votes. Yep. They needed 20 votes, and they only got 17. And, of course, again, not bothered by this, President John I would submit the Louisiana Purchase to Congress, finalizing that, giving him his popularity that is rightfully deserved. Excuse me. Got hiccups. In 1804... the Associate Justice Alfred Moore would resign, and the Supreme Court, and the House of Representatives would appoint Joseph Story to the Supreme Court. President John I would send Lewis and Clark out to do their expedition. And of course, the 1804 election, Democratic-Republican Vice President Thomas Jefferson would defeat Federalist Minister Rufus King 112-64 to win re-election in a landslide. In 1805, there is nothing noteworthy. 1806, Associate Justice William Patterson would die whilst in the Supreme Court, and the House would appoint Smith Thompson to the Supreme Court. And John I would sign the Non-Importation Act. 1807, John I would sign the Embargo Act, which all that popularity that was given to him by the Louisiana Purchase, down the drain yet again. In 1808, President John I signs the Act of Prohibiting the Importation of Slaves, which boosts his popularity up a little bit in the North, but boosts his popularity even further down in the South. the Democratic-Republican Secretary James Madison would defeat Federalist Minister Charles Pinckney 93 to 82 to become the 4th vice president. So James Madison does fairly well. Or Charles Pitt. Excuse me, I got something on my mouth. Excuse me. So that ends off this timeline for this episode, and we have the current Supreme Court as of the end of 1808, beginning of 1809. We have a 5-4 conservative court. Yes, the liberals or Democratic Republicans are starting to get in more liberal judges. We have Chief Justice Bushrod Washington, Associate Justice John Q. Thomas, Associate Justice William Cushing, Associate Justice Joseph Story, Associate Justice Henry Livingston, Associate Justice John Marshall, Associate Justice William Johnson, Associate Justice Smith Thompson, and Associate Justice Samuel Chase. So I hope you guys read the video. This is the Chaotic One saying, peace.